You're listening to the Second Look podcast, where we take a closer look at what we're learning each Sunday at Connection Church to help you grow in your walk with Christ. Here are your hosts, Pastor Joe Terreri and Pastor Dan DeRochers.
Welcome to The Second Look. My name is Dan.
And I'm Joe.
And we're here talking about finding freedom from bitterness. But first, hey, Joe.
Hello, Dan.
Are Canadians the most forgiveness-seeking people on the planet? And why?
I don't know. Why would we talk about Canadians?
I don't know. They're always saying sorry.
Yeah. Canadians are interesting folks. Honestly, I love Canada.
Yeah, I'm going to Canada for only the third time in my life.
Oh, right. You and Alicia.
Yes, this summer. One of the times was we were driving to Detroit, and the shortest route was from Buffalo,
Yes.
Niagara Falls, and into across.
Through Windsor.
Yes,
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, when you go to Canada, see if you can get someone to forgive you when you're there. And, and we'll revisit it later this summer.
Okay, does a Canadian saying sorry demand that you forgive them? Or is this one of those paradoxical things if a tree falls in the forest?
I don't know why we're talking about Canadians, but I'm glad we are. Dan, you can do whatever you want. I just think Jesus, you can do what you want, and yet if you want to obey Jesus, if a Canadian wants you to forgive them, you still have to.
Well, okay. All right. Well,
I mean, is there a more irrelevant country?
forgive us, Canada.
Forgive us, Canada. Is there a more irrelevant country in geopolitically, like Canada? It's always like, I mean, it's all benign. Like nothing, like it doesn't seem like anything bad's ever going to happen with Canada.
Like good or bad, right? I mean, like Switzerland.
Yeah, they're just there.
Yeah, they're just, I mean, but here's what I would say. The flag's a big plus.
In Switzerland. That's terrible. That's terrible. All right, let's move on.
Okay, now that we've gotten the banter over with, we're talking about forgiveness in order to find freedom from bitterness.
Yes.
And one of the first things that you covered in the sermon was that unresolved hurt always leads to bitterness.
Yeah.
And there's so much to that statement. And I think the thing that really struck me about that statement was it's our responsibility, not that someone hurt us, but the unresolved nature of it.
Yes, which feels super unfair, right?
Right.
You know, like at one level, somebody says something, does something to you, and now you're living with it. You didn't ask them to do it. And now you are dealing with the fallout internally from that person's mistreatment of you. And Jesus comes along and has the audacity to say, you have to forgive them.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of world we live in. We live in a world where no matter what kind of relationships you have, there's always going to be a point where forgiveness will be required, unless you're not close to anybody. And some people kind of take that route, like I'm going to just detach from anybody who I'm not going to get close to anybody. I don't trust people, that whole thing. Well, that's a wonderful way to have a real not fulfilling life. But yeah, we always need to be aware that the condition of our hearts, and I had this conversation with someone after church yesterday, actually. It was interesting, that the condition of our hearts is always our responsibility. So here's whose fault it never is. It's not the person who hurt you. It's not the government's. It's not your parents. It's not your kids. It's not your boss. It's not your neighbor. It's you. Because I think what we often do is instead of dealing with the hurt that we're experiencing, we deflect blame back onto them and we continue to focus on the wrong. And that's human nature. That is what we naturally do.
Because they did something wrong to you.
Sure.
Right? So
absolutely.
They're not absolved of that responsibility.
No.
So what about it is our responsibility?
Our responsibility is to forgive and to keep our heart clean. And I think it's so fascinating in the passage that Jesus begins the story about a king who calls in his servants to settle accounts. And so I think in our lives, in order to keep our hearts clean, and just, I said this one sentence yesterday, and I'm not sure everyone caught it, but I intentionally wrote it into my manuscript because I really was thinking about how bitterness clogs up the valves of our heart through which the love and grace of Jesus is supposed to flow through. Like the love of Jesus is supposed to be in our hearts, but often it can't get out of our hearts because we're filled with bitterness. So just like when you have a heart attack, your arteries get clogged. Bitterness clogs up your arteries and your valves. And so the love of God cannot flow through you. So we need to think about, when it comes to bitterness and unresolved hurts, you have to say, I'm responsible for what's going on inside of me. I'm not responsible for other people's actions. I'm not responsible to fix people. I'm not responsible to force someone to reconcile with me, but I am responsible for the condition of my own heart.
So you said that it was interesting that the king brought someone in to settle accounts.
Yep.
And this was, obviously there were debts that were owed.
Yep.
And so he was looking at these accounts to bring them up to speed.
Correct,
or
yeah.
collect payment or
Yep.
whatever it was. How does that...
It's almost like when you get a call from a collector. It's like,
right.
It's like, hey, it's you owe me, and when are you going to pay?
So what does that look like in our life? So this is obviously a parable.
Sure.
Right? So number one, the story is not actually...
No, it's a
didn't actually
fictitious story.
Right.
So one commentator actually said that 10,000 talents may be more than all of the money that was in circulation during Jesus' day at the time. Like, that was only one person's view, but the number was so ridiculous that there may not even have been that much money.
Right. That's really funny.
Yes.
So what is the application to our own life of settling accounts? What does it look like for us to settle accounts?
Well, I think you have to put it in context in the sense of, when I have bitterness in my heart and I am walking in unforgiveness, there is an account with another person, figuratively speaking, that has not been settled. So in order for me to settle accounts, I need to take the step to forgive. And so I would say we need to keep our accounts real short and not let them keep building up and not let the account remain open for a really long time. And so that is an intentional step. And I love that the king needs to settle his accounts, and when people hurt us, we need to settle that account.
There's actually a direct application to accounts, I think, when someone actually owes you money.
Yes.
You have an account, or they have an account open with you, or whatever, or you borrow money.
Yep.
I'll pay you back.
Yep.
Doesn't it seem like there is an interpersonal, like there's this metaphorical account
Yes.
that's open,
Yes.
as well as a physical account, and the longer it goes unpaid,
Yeah.
the deeper kind of that metaphorical account can hurt you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like that's kind of hovering over the relationship, and so you want to get that resolved.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to be people who keep short accounts, and we do that by forgiving. And again, yesterday, we were really clear that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
keeping a short account does not mean, hey, we're going to ride tandem bikes together again. No, there could be a time where we need to say, I forgive you, but you're actually not welcome back into my life.
Yeah.
There may be a reason for that, or I forgive that person, but they have no interest in reconciling, or we hurt them. Yeah. We ask for their forgiveness, and they don't welcome us back into their life. And so there's lots of scenarios that we don't have control over, but here's what we absolutely have control over, or to put that another way, we can absolutely obey Jesus when it comes to his call to be people of unlimited forgiveness towards those who have hurt us.
So I'm just thinking about my kids.
Sure.
Right. One of them kicks the other one or accidentally trips one of them. It's usually something that's fairly benign, but seems like it's the end of the world.
Yes.
And you say...
Everyone starts lawyering up. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's a whole thing. You say you're sorry to your sister. Mm-hmm. Sorry, baby. I forgive you. Right?
Yep.
But the words, I forgive you, don't necessarily mean that forgiveness has happened for those kids in that moment. And sometimes there is a gap between the statement, I forgive you, and 15 or 20 minutes later when they're playing like they're best friends again.
Yeah.
So all that to say, like, I think that little example to me says forgiveness isn't a moment,
Correct.
right? Forgiveness takes time to show its fruit in your life. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think what we want to honor Jesus's words really clearly in this moment that we're talking about it. So here's what I would say. Forgiveness is a choice that we make as an act of our will out of obedience to Jesus and love for other people. But I've also noticed, or I should say, I've also noticed that I can work to forgive someone, but there are times when I'm still hurt by what they did.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's totally resolved yet in my heart. So I do think we need to have a category for forgiveness being a process. And I would say when you have a real traumatic moment with a wrong done against you, and I'm thinking particularly of maybe you end up getting divorced because your spouse cheated on you, or you get abused by a relative or a parent or a church leader. I never want to shout at those people. You have to forgive, but we do have to obey Jesus, no matter what the circumstances are. And at the same time, we do need to also have a category for I forgive you, but I'm also working on what this hurt has actually done to me.
Yeah.
And so there's a process there, but the choice to forgive can always be made, but it doesn't mean all the pain goes away. And I think that's a really important thing to consider, that you can choose to forgive, but it doesn't mean you're going to wake up the next morning and be like, oh, that doesn't bother me anymore. Listen, there are some hurts that really bother you. So, and the real difference is are you going to pay them? Are you going to make them pay? Are you going to let them go? Because sometimes you got to process your own stuff with a good counselor, with a pastor, with a friend. But you can do all that without making them pay and actually forgiving them. And there's a lot of nuance there. But we can't say it's okay if you're living your life when you're not obeying Jesus.
Someone has to pay, though.
Sure.
Right? The examples that you gave even in the sermon, that window.
Yeah.
Someone has to pay.
Yeah. Well, and that's,
so who pays?
Yeah.
If you're not exacting payment on the person who hurt you, where does that payment come from?
Oh, Dan, I'm so glad you asked. Jesus paid. So that's actually what we need to consider. We're actually not making them pay, because what we're doing is, and I probably should have spent some more time on this in my message yesterday.
That's why I'm asking you now.
Yes. But, time was already over all three services. But I say all that because what we're actually doing is letting the grace and the blood and the sacrifice of Jesus for the sins of the world be covered. And we're saying Jesus already paid for that sin, so I don't need to make them pay. But let's not be unclear about the fact that there's still a relational debt between us. So we actually have to absorb some of that. Even though we could say theologically and actually Jesus absorbed their sin, we actually need to be able to say, like, yes, you sinned against me, but I'm not going to make you pay for that, because that sin's been covered by Christ, and I'm joining with him in his graciousness towards you, and I'm letting you go. So there's a payment there relationally. It's not the same kind of payment Jesus made, but there is something very real there.
What are ways that we, in a season of unforgiveness, what are ways that we make other people pay?
Yeah, I think cold shoulder, ignoring, talking about them behind their back. Here's how I know I have issues with somebody. This is like me personally, unvarnished. I know that I have bitterness in my heart against someone when their name comes up. I find something to say about them that isn't great, or I try to put them in a bad light, or I talk about them in a way that's pejorative. And so, even if it's just between Cheryl and I, it's not like I'm like publicly doing it. And I'm not talking about like someone makes a decision and I disagree with it. I'm talking about like there's animosity. And my animosity, I'm a verbal guy, I'm extroverted for the most part. And so my animosity is going to come out in my words. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So I need to be careful about that. It's like that bristly thing that happens with my facial expression. So I'm making them pay in the sense where I'm not even being gracious in my thoughts and disposition towards them in that moment. So I think that's how we make them pay. And I think that's how, I think there's probably a variety of different ways, but people, we make people pay all kinds of different ways.
We also absorb some of that as well by living in unforgiveness.
Sure.
Right? There's a toll on us. What are some of the ways that we ourselves feel that pain or that weight or payment of unforgiveness?
That's good. That's a really good question. I would just go back to Hebrews 12:15, where the author of Hebrews says, "See to it that no bitter root grows up in you." And so bitterness in us is like a root. And so what do roots do? They produce life, they produce fruit. And so when you are walking in bitterness, bitter fruit will come out of your life. And what does it do? It causes trouble and defiles many. I mean, that hit me like a ton of bricks this week in my sermon prep. Like what Hebrews 12:15 tells us about what bitterness does in us is shocking. I could have probably built my whole message around that. But when there's bitterness in you, that's affecting your children, that's affecting your marriage, that's affecting your workplace, that's affecting your friendships, that is affecting your relationship with God, that's affecting your relationship with yourself. Bitterness clouds everything. And not like when the hurts are deep, it's acute. It's like it's clouding everything. When they're more latent, you don't really know it's there until it comes up. But here's what I've noticed about people, Dan. I've noticed that sometimes when I get to know someone for the first time, it is amazing to me how many conversations I've had with people I've never met before. And I'm not talking pastorally. I'm just talking about Joe the citizen out and about in Lower Pottsgrove. That people will tell you about who hurt them when you first meet them, like at an alarming rate.
Yeah.
Like it comes out in our words. Like that unresolved hurt almost becomes part of the story of who we are and how we present ourselves and how we let people get to know us.
Yeah.
And so that bitterness will produce bitter fruit. And as I said yesterday, it'll produce bitter words, bitter attitudes, and bitter actions. And of course, you've heard the maxim, hurt people hurt people.
Right.
And so, or to put that another way, bitter people hurt people.
Bitter people. Oh.
Okay. All right.
Sorry. Are there
That's really good.
Are there ways that we can help someone? If there's someone in our life that we are close to,
Sure,
who's dealing with unforgiveness, and it's apparent to us,
yeah,
are there ways that we can help?
Sure. Yeah, here's a really important question. Ready? How long are you going to hang on to that for?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, like, my wife said that to me probably a month ago.
Wow.
She didn't say it exactly like that with the same snideness I just said it, because she knows Jesus well. And no, she said it with a way, like, she just kind of looked at me. She's like, why are you still there?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I am still there. And so I think it's really important that we just ask, like for the people around us who we consider friends, when they're rehearsing the wrongs of the past with their stories or with their attitudes or with their words, I actually think friendship says, are you going to forgive them?
Wow.
Are you going to do that? And I think we need to listen when people see bitterness in us. I think we need to, and Dan, I'm going to say something, and I think there's going to be about 1.0 listeners who are actually going to identify with this. My heart, I get to talk and interact with a lot of pastors. Pastors carry a lot of relational wounds. And I'm not saying this because I need sympathy. I don't. But I do think that a lot of pastors I meet with and I get to know, when I get to know them well, they will let you see their woundedness. And a lot of the woundedness that pastors carry is usually around people leaving their church. And listen, no one's going to stay at the same church forever for the most part. But there is a sense when people leave a church or people, you're in relationship with so many people as a pastor. That's why I said what I said yesterday when I said, hurts come from people ending relationships with you with no reasons. I mean, that has happened to me. And if you ask any pastor, just ask him, what was it, him or her, what was it like during COVID for you? And if they're being honest, without exaggeration, 99% of pastors I meet, when we talk about COVID, there is a knowing pain that pastors carry, and I think other leaders carry it too, but that's the circle I run in, all the cool kids. There's a knowing pain that pastors carry from the leading churches and being in ministry during the COVID years. And it was a very disorienting time to lead, and people absolutely lost their minds and I don't know how to say this, expected their pastors to know exactly how to handle everything.
Right.
And people left churches, and people, we know all the things. It's a recent enough memory, but man, there's a lot of pain there. And so if I could preach that message to, a room full of pastors, I would in a second, because some of the things I talked about, like, some of the things I needed to unburden my soul with that I shared in my message yesterday, not all of them, but a few of them were COVID related during those COVID years, because I felt like people really hurt me during that time, and I didn't know why. And it was super confusing to me. And then I realized 3 years later, oh my gosh, I'm still angry about that.
Yeah.
I still have bitterness there. And so I just want to, not to make it overly personal, but I just want to kind of turn that back around to those who are listening and say, time doesn't heal all wounds. You could be carrying that bitterness for a while. And why don't we take this opportunity to really release those who have hurt you, cancel their debt, let them go. And yesterday was about finding freedom from bitterness. I would say you need freedom, and when you let them go, you're letting them go free too.
Yeah.
And that's really where the freedom is. You get free, they get free, everyone wins.
Yeah. Yeah. On behalf of Canadians everywhere, I'd like to just say, Joe, sorry.
I forgive you, Canada. Yeah, I forgive you, Canada. I'd also like to say, Canada, I'm actually okay with you not being a big player in the geopolitical world. It sounds great to me.
Yeah. Tim Hortons. On behalf of Joe and all the Timbits everywhere, this has been another episode of The Second Look. You can catch this sermon and much more at our website, cometoconnect.com. Have a great week.